The strangers from the internet are standing outside. The strangers from the internet have come from far and wide. But I cannot receive them. I hardly believe in them.
Welcome back to Shadow Yaddo. I'm Elena Richardson. In my early days in New York, as a young writer, I had a brilliant boss who had a list of forbidden words. A woman could not be personified by a hair color, she insisted, no matter how many times a blonde might walk into a bar. The word home was also high on her no-no list. People might have a beautiful house, but a beautiful home was a shudder-inducing cliché. But I don't believe there are synonyms in the English language. So while I get its potential for duddiness, I'm a defender of the word home. It's nuanced and complex and filled with emotional ties. When I ask my daughter if she's coming home for the holidays, I'm not wondering about bricks and mortar. I mean me. This episode, we're holding up the idea of home to the light, twisting it around to see what we can tease out. Three massively talented artists each take us home in a surprising way. And, like the word itself, the connections between the three turn out to be deeper than the surface. They also share a talent for making the invisible visible. You'll hear an editorial by NPR veteran Jacki Lyden, who has worked behind a scrim for years as a reporter. She's home now, in the key swing state of Wisconsin, where she'll be speaking as herself about our upcoming election. I'll be in conversation with the wonderful writer and my dear pal, Andrew O'Hagan, about his new novel, Mayflies, and how he illuminates the overlooked. But first, we'll hear from composer and songwriter Gabriel Kahane, who was recently named Creative Chair of the Oregon Symphony. He created a groundbreaking oratorio titled Emergency Shelter Intake Form. Listen as he shares some music and his thoughts on inequality through the lens of homelessness.
What brings you here? What happened? Where did you sleep last night?
I think it was in the spring of 2016, I got a call, how would you like to write a piece about homelessness for the Oregon Symphony, but it can't be political. and my first instinct was absolutely not, for an ivory tower, largely white patriarchal institution to take on something like that just felt rife with all sorts of political red flags and a kind of like minefield of questions about appropriation and authority. And but then at the same time, I knew that the Oregon Symphony was this extraordinary kind of little engine that could.
You're the chorus of inconvenient statistics, legislation, and relevant documents.
The thing that I kind of lived in fear of was writing something that sort of tugged at the heartstrings, but didn't really hold the audience's feet to the fire. And through this series of interviews with people I had met, I did a small amount of volunteering at a shelter. And through that, I met some other volunteers who had themselves experienced homelessness. And through all of those conversations that I had with people who had had bouts of homelessness, the thing that kept recurring was the banality of poverty. And, you go to this office and then you take a bus and have this form signed, and then you go have this form signed, and you finally, you get to the shelter at 1 a.m, and then they kick you out at 6:30 the next morning.
If you answered yes to living with family or friends, please complete the following.
one of the things that really sort of opened my eyes to the extent to which homelessness and housing insecurity are just nodes on a spectrum of how we experience poverty, because visible poverty and visible homelessness tends to have a particular kind of texture. Often the unhoused population who are facing homelessness are the ones who are, dealing with mental illness or who are dealing with substance abuse issues. And so I think it's very easy, even for really well-intentioned progressives, to have this notion that homelessness is about drug addiction, homelessness is about mental illness. And it's really not. For the vast majority of people who are experiencing homelessness on any given night, 90% of people experiencing homelessness are invisible because they're housed. They're either in hotels or they're in shelters, or they're doubled up with family and friends. For a huge part of that population, it is that they were deciding between paying the electricity bill and paying the rent, paying for prescription drugs and paying the rent. And the vast majority of us have been in that position of looking at bills to pay on a particular first of the month and saying, oh shit, well, what am I which bill do I wait until the 10th of the month to pay, or which bill do I not pay at all?
Well, certainly we can all agree that we are in the midst of a housing crisis, for which the most effective solution is to build new homes at more affordable prices. The only nagging question that remains, the one that most nearly pertains, is where these units should be erected so that we might keep protected our sun-drenched, gut-renovated, almost 1/8 acre Victorian domain.
One of the first things that I did was to ask the symphony if they could put together or identify a chorus of singers whose lived experience would bear witness. And as it turned out, a chorus already existed. The Maybell Community Singers, this extraordinary group of people from this organization, the Maybell Center, that for the better part of 3 decades has tried to create community for those living in isolated poverty. I wrote the final movement of the piece for them.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for tracking from office to office. Thank you. Thank you for enduring the long lines.
Andrew O'Hagan is the author of 9 books, including his latest novel, Mayflies. We first met more than 25 years ago when his non-fiction book, The Missing, was published. It was a revelation to me then, and I still find myself referring to it. Our Fathers was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Be Near Me won the Los Angeles Times Prize for Fiction. And his essay collection, The Secret Life, 3 True Stories of the Digital Age, explores the intersection of privacy, identity, and selfhood, and was named one of the top 10 books of the year by Publishers Weekly. Oh, and in his spare time, he's editor-at-large of the London Review of Books and owns a cool cafe in Primrose Hill with his best friend, Sam Frears.
We tore down these old walls just to rebuild them up new. And I look to the mountains, to the hills where I called my own.
I've heard you say that this new novel, Mayflies, is nearly all true. Can you tell us a bit about the origins of the book and also the structural choice to build it around 2 time periods?
Once or twice in a writer's career, a book comes to them almost as a gift. And Mayflies came to me that way. It's the most autobiographical work that I've ever done. And it largely tells the story of my friendship in Scotland with a group of boys, but primarily with the character Tully Dawson, who is very, very much based on a friend of mine called Keith Martin that I had from the age of 13 right through his slightly too short life. When I got the call a couple of years ago that he was terminally ill, I suddenly realised that The subject had been waiting for me. Keith actually, in his last year, asked me straight out. He said, would you ever write about us? He knew that there was such a rich hinterland there. We all have a story of growing up, of course. Ours was spectacularly dramatic, I thought, full of local colour and language and loyalty and entering into life and finding out what it is. And I knew that I could tell this story in two halves. The first half would be back in 1986, just after the miners' strike here in the UK, when a bunch of Scottish boys who love music, who love camaraderie, who are very political, who are engaged with films and just trying to find out who they are in the world, make this trip for a weekend to a music festival in Manchester in July 1986. I knew the book would be taken up the first half with that, and the second half 30 years later, during that last year of Tully's life.
And then the story jumps forward to autumn of 2017. Tully has asked James, or Noodles, the men in this book all have nicknames. Tully has asked James to help him arrange an assisted suicide in Switzerland. He wants to die with dignity. That request raises huge issues, of course, but for me the poignancy of the book lies in the fact that you restored dignity to all of these guys, not just Tully. They each have an inner life, they have lively intellects, they have dreams. Does this feel heightened to you now, as maybe it did for us during the Thatcher years, because we're living in such a polarised, cold world, where too many right now want to strip dignity from others?
I think that's definitely true, Elena. One of the things that's overwhelmed me about the response to this book, and it's probably had the most powerful response to any of my books thus far, the surprise was that people, I think, in situations of lockdown, in situations of isolation at the moment, felt that the book spoke to them about fellow feeling, loyalty, about working out once and for all who mattered to you in your life. And I think if a novel or a piece of music or a film can do that, or a poem can do that, then it's one of the gifts of the arts, that we can invite the communion of people we don't even know, not only into our lives, but us into theirs. In a sense that this isolation we're feeling, I think, has requested subconsciously the need for that communication that has always mattered to you, has mattered to me, and the people that we both feed off and supply. Your humanity means much less on its own in isolation. It's only when you reach out and reach across that you feel all the wind in your sails.
The friendships in Mayflies are held together by endless, sometimes exhausting, banter and the compiling of lists. The guys also use movie dialogue to stand in for whatever they're feeling. It's both a sort of cataloguing of the world and a shield. The emotional shorthand is fantastically well done. How hard was it to recreate those 1980s touchstones? Did you have to do a lot of research?
It's interesting to me how little research I had to do. And I am an inveterate researcher. I mean, my non-fiction side is applied every other day. I'm editor-at-large of the London Review of Books. I write long-form journalism for them and for the New York Review of Books. I've always had that muscle, if you like, that I like to exercise, that I feel compelled to exercise. And that involves research, covering trials, taking journalistic notes, being in a reporting situation. So research is, manna from the gods, usually, to me. But as a novelist too, I've had to throw myself into sometimes quite lengthy research. But with this book, it was all there. The lyrics were in my head. The movie quotations were there from the 1980s. A tremendous sense of having retained all the rubbish and litter and detritus of my youth. A truly misspent youth, I'm proud to say. But fundamentally, the world of those boys was interior to me,
But I was also struck because that habit seems very male to me, to talk in that sort of protected way. There's a distancing that happens via the banter and list forming. Occasionally, Tully will break through and say something straightforwardly emotional, but he always shuts down again. That was one of the things that moved me to tears about these boys, and it connects back to restoring dignity to your characters, because it shows that they're not losers or misfits. It acknowledges their inarticulateness while simultaneously giving them language. So that brought into focus for me the closing down that can happen to people when there's too much scar tissue. The prime example in Mayflies is the fathers, who are all disasters. The boys, through the slagging off, form a gruff family. They seem to parent one another, yes?
Well, that was so important. It would be a mischaracterization of that culture, the culture that we were born into, to suggest the women were as much like that as the men. The women were often the glue. These families cohered, often through not just the emotional and psychological efforts, but the work that women put into those families, whilst the men missing in action. And there was something about central Scotland in those years, and not only there, but heavily working class communities, I suppose, around the Western world, where men were enclosed, emotionally cut off, and often sort of infantilized, that they didn't quite take responsibility for their families. And that lasted and came to a sort of summit, I would argue, during the Thatcher years, where a lot of them lost work and turned to drink, and a kind of disembodied fatherhood was quite common in my childhood. I'd be a liar if I suggested that it was just my family or just me and my mates. I mean, it was so general as to be a sort of an absolute commonplace.
Is that why Tully and Noodles don't have children?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think they wanted to reinvent the wheel when it came to how to be a man, actually. This is a book about masculinity and also how it's improved and corrected and deepened by the women in their lives. But that's the kind of thing you want to do in a novel, is create, if you like, a piece of moral arithmetic where the women and the men and the expectations and the hinterlands are all working in quite a rich way, so that you, the reader, can actually do the imaginative work yourself.
I've always loved that your fiction and your non-fiction stay just the right side of sentiment. We come from a land that can be twee. It's prone to a sort of mawkish emotionalism, the tartan-wrapped mock-and-slosh side of Scotland. Your work reveals that you have a big empathetic soul, but you're not soft. Is it your journalistic instincts that keeps the grit in your spine, or is it more of an aesthetic choice?
It's the story of my creative life, is trying to, as it were, create a space for ambivalence, create a space for ambiguity. I grew up in a very, as did you, I believe, very tightly wound world of sectarianism, that you were either literally white or black, you were either Catholic or Protestant, you were either a man or a woman, you were a mainlander or an islander, you were a Highlander or a Lowlander, you were Scottish or you were English. You know, everything was about the binary. And thankfully, we've come into a more nuanced, complicated era. And I feel like a natural fish in this era, in the sense that I always wanted binaries to be broken down. You know, I always wanted straight and gay to be sort of dissolved. I always wanted women's power and strength in the masculine and women in the feminine and men to become apparent and exposed and free-floating. That seemed to me a creative future that I could really participate in. And I thought that when I was quite young. So what you described, that attempt to open up the heart, but not into floods of tears. Open up the heart, but with strength, with command, with a sense that, yes, there is emotion and there is feeling, but there's also facts and logic and the opposite of your feeling strongly, which is somebody else's equal and opposite strong feeling.
And politically right now, that's incredibly important, the notion that scar tissue can take us in one of two ways. It either gives resilience and strength, or it traps in a kind of not understood chronic pain, of hopelessness and anger. I see all over the world, and sadly sometimes even in some of my own relatives back home, that those who feel dispossessed circle back to fascism and insularity. One antidote, for me, is to take where we come from and use it to galvanize a future, rather than hiding in a fantasy of past glory.
I couldn't agree more. I think we're always in a sadder place when we begin to mistake our victimhood for our identity.
But Andy, is your imaginative landscape Ayrshire or Glasgow? Really, I'm wondering how you balance the reality of still spending a lot of time in Scotland, back in your familiar stomping grounds, and the need for Ayrshire to be unreal, to be an imaginative lodestone.
All novelists, certainly, I mean, I could speak for other artists possibly in the same vein, but certainly novelists, short story writers, and sometimes poets do have a landscape of the imagination. And you augment it, you grow it, you can change it, as Elizabeth Bishop did, eventually became Brazil. We're open to emigration, but For many of us, there's a fundamental landscape of the memory. I would say that the landscape of the imagination, as far as I'm concerned, brings me back to Ayrshire and that archetype of that landscape, of the 25 miles to Glasgow, of the Isle of Arran spread out in front of the horizon and the sun going down over there at the end of every day, the fields and the flora and fauna of Robert Burns, the great Scots poet, being there, not only in front of my eyes, but the words and the sounds being on my tongue. That somehow you grow with that as a writer, and I'm, in a sense, not interested any more in shaking it off than Faulkner was interested in shaking off the South. It's just there now, I think, permanently. That's not to say I won't write a book. In fact, I'm writing one now, set in London, but the hinterland will still be there.
This is when I call my
Thanks for tuning in. We're grateful to our sponsors, including the Stewarts and Dake Family Gift. To the artists who contributed music, we offer warmest thanks. In order of appearance, they are Joseph Keckler for his adaptation of our theme music, Strangers from the Internet, Gabriel Kahane, the Oregon Symphony, Carlos Calmer, Alicia Holmara, and the Maybell Community Singers for selections from Emergency Shelter Intake Form, which is available on CD or via digital download on Bandcamp. Stevie Macleod is a songwriter from Aviemore in the Scottish Highlands. His album, Where I Call Home, just came out. Phoebe Legere's rendition of Glory's Suffrage Song No. 1 is on SoundCloud, along with more of her music. And, as ever, big thanks to our sound engineer, CJ DeGenero, and to the wonderful Christy Albano, who really is the genius behind this show. In parting, we'll leave you with memoirist, foreign correspondent, and now commentator, Jacki Lyden. Here's her letter from Wisconsin.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Our truth comes marching on.
For over 3 decades, you heard me on NPR, and I loved my public radio platform. Yet it feels like only now can I finally really speak my mind, and there's never been a better moment to be a solo voice. I'm speaking as a Wisconsin voter and a daughter of my hometown, Delafield, Wisconsin, population 7,000, where the battle for the nation's soul will be taking place. I went to Cushing Elementary School here, named for a Civil War hero and Medal of Honor recipient who was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg. And as I look around at my town, now quite affluent, I wonder if we are more divided now than we were in 1863. Let me tell you what I mean. On the second Sunday of September in southeastern Wisconsin, I looked out at Lake Negawicka, where we've lived since 1929. I saw a Trump boat parade motoring by. 40 boats, festooned in red, white, and blue, and Trump flags, a floating frat party of Rotarians and Uncle Sam drag. To see Trump flags flying like so many medieval coat of arms over waves where I normally look for sandhill cranes and where my grandfather taught me to fish subverts my natural world harmony, which is almost certainly the desired effect. That lake is somehow now politically their fiefdom, and they will hold it. It's not the first time I've seen things like this. I covered Northern Ireland as an NPR reporter. In Belfast, I remember back in the mid-1990s, the beating drums through the Catholic neighborhoods during the Orange Parades, the very tempo of triumphalism. But in Wisconsin, the dairy state, we serve our triumphalism like sour cream. Or maybe I should say tartar sauce. The fish fry place down the road had a sign recently. If you're not wearing a mask, I'll assume that you're an American citizen and understand the Constitution. My friend Phil left his order behind, cooling when he saw that. Phil teaches high school civics and wrote a letter called Neil Gorsuch Explains Why I Left My Takeout, quoting a book Gorsuch wrote called A Republic, If You Can Keep It, A Plea for Civility, from Gorsuch, not Ben Franklin. Or take this example, my new MAGA neighbor who flies his Tea Party flag at all times so that I can never look out at the lake any longer without, don't tread on me, treading right on me. I think if I didn't exist, he'd have to invent me. We're in what's called the WOW counties, as in W-O-W, wow. These aren't just any American counties. We tipped the election to Donald Trump. Remember this acronym. It stands for Washington, Ozaukee, and Waukesha, the collar counties around Milwaukee. It's gorgeous, glacial kettle moraine country, lake country, dozens of charming lakes. But we're buried in a blinding whiteness. And I'm not talking about the snow. And though Democrats are doing better here than they have in years past, cutting into Trump's margin, and Biden signs do pop up amid the Trump clusters, I'm edgy. And I should be, because we who oppose Trump are standing on a knife's edge out here. To live in Wisconsin, to be a Wisconsin voter, is to be at the heart of the intersection between hope and triumphalism, between history, this is where Joe McCarthy made his name, and the will to go forward. That's the state motto, forward. Yet after 2010, despite Barack Obama carrying Wisconsin in 2012, this state became, by any measure, one of the most gerrymandered in American history under Governor Scott Walker. 23,000 votes. I think about this number, Trump's winning number in my state, less than 1%. That's the combined population of my hometown and the town I went to high school in. It's a door-to-door struggle for the future. The GOP calls our house often, the Democrats call less. My mother has Joe Biden signs taped over her bed and says, at age 90, "Sometimes I feel I should pull the ripcord, Jackie, but I have to stay alive and vote." Joe Biden is about 6 points ahead in Wisconsin, and it's the durability of this number, which is interesting. If Donald Trump loses Wisconsin, and I'm ever more hopeful, women are high on the list to thank. Women have defected from Trump 60 to 39%. Also, black voters must turn out. This summer, we had a Black Lives Matter rally in our small town of 7,000. High school kids organized it, and one biracial family. I spoke. One white man asked, "What was the point?" And I said, "You are." There were 43 such rallies in Wisconsin. And then came Kenosha, August the 23rd, the police shooting of Jacob Blake, the violent protests, the looting. 5 days later came the lionizing of Kyle Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old vigilante who crossed state lines with a long gun, accused of leaving 2 people dead and a third, a paramedic, wounded. Some friends in my hometown worry that Rittenhouse will get off completely. Even when I was in kindergarten, we were a divided town. Kids taunted each other. "Nixon, Nixon, he's our man. Kennedy's in the garbage can." My friend Joni from those days, who has a tattoo and design business in the Bay Area now, reminds me that when a mother arrived to pick us kids up from school, she looked on in horror. In 1968, Paul Newman came to our town to campaign for George McGovern, if you can believe it. He just filmed Cool Hand Luke, and the town turned out in droves to see him. But Richard Nixon won Wisconsin and the election that year. And 2 years later, Earth Day started in Wisconsin under Governor Gaylord Nelson in 1970, a Democrat. We've elected William Proxmire, Robert La Follette, and now Senator Tammy Baldwin. We bask in the glory of the environmentalist Aldo Leopold, who wrote a Sand County Almanac. We venerate John Muir, who was raised here, who walked down the Mississippi to go west. The Republican Party was raised here, too. It was officially born in Ripon, Wisconsin. We've elected Paul Ryan, Ron Johnson, Scott Walker. All are from here, even if their stars have dimmed. How can these people, ask myself, today's GOP, have grown up, like me, between the Mississippi River and Lake Michigan, between the promise of personal liberty and the will to dominate at all costs in the most nihilistic way possible? How can we possibly be from the same state? Perhaps they think that we will always belong to Norway, ever the sons of Olaf, armed to the teeth. In the Wisconsin where I was raised, we were taught the Wisconsin idea. This from the University of Wisconsin, the idea that education should influence people's lives beyond the classroom. This notion of service, of community effort, was paramount. Wisconsin pioneered workman's comp, tax reform, and the public regulation of utilities. How will Wisconsin vote in this presidential election? I hesitate to predict. Biden, he's our man. Trump is in the garbage can. Or at least let him be on the ash heap of history, thrown there by Wisconsin kids like me. Love from the Badger State.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory.
Take care of yourself and remember to vote. We'll be back November 12th with more Shadow Yaddo.